Here, I'll tell you a little bit about our speaker before I forget. There are evaluation forms. Did anyone not pick up an evaluation form when they signed in? We did Human Development and Family Studies from Pennsylvania State University. Her program of research focused on two areas: normative and non-normative transitions and processes in middle life. The first area of research investigates the factors that shape employment transitions and processes and the influence of such transitions and processes on daily psychological well-being and health in midlife. The second research area examines the impacts of caregiving on adolescent and adults with a disability in midlife and well-being and health. Dr. Wong's current work integrates these two areas of research by examining how non-normative parenting affects employment processes and the subsequent influence on well-being and health. So, thank you, Dr. Wong,
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, and I'm really excited to be here. I've been on the other side watching these great presentations, so it's really an honor to be here and present to. So, thank you for the great introduction. So this is a more complete title than what was sent out. So I am going to talk a little bit more in terms of caregiving and work that interplay, and specifically in terms of parents of kids with developmental disability. When I refer to kids, I'm actually talking about adolescents and adults, but it's a handful, so bear with me if I slip up and say kids, okay? So in terms of, just give you an overview in terms of what I'm going to cover today, I'm going to just kind of briefly cover some of my research program and framework, some of it you described a little bit, and then I'm going to talk about two studies. The first looks at daily work stressors on the waking cortisol level in mothers of individuals with and without developmental disability. And the second study focused on working on spillover. And it was inspired by my first paper, but I'm using a different data set, and specifically I'm looking at mothers and fathers of individuals with and without developmental disability. So one thing about me, if you can't hear me, let me know. If I talk too fast, let me know. I'm from the East Coast, but I try to slow it down a little more because I think it's better for me. Okay. So one of the area, as indicated in the title, I'm interested in is midlife, right? So a lot of times people ask me, well, what describes the period of midlife, right? So yeah, midlife, what does it look like? So there's a quote by Dr. Grimm, psychologist, and you're probably very familiar with it because you're a psychologist. So he argues that the period between 30 to 70 years of age, that covers midlife. But the true heart of midlife is between 40 to 60. And I'm going to argue that most researchers utilize 40 to 60 as that bracket of describing somebody in midlife. So think about this, right? That's a big age gap, right? Like age range in terms of midlife. And what I can tell you, across all the different life periods, you're going to be all of you here and be spending more time in midlife and late development than any other period of the life course. So I think that's why it's important to look at parents of kids with developmental disability. Not just because they're living longer, but their kids are living longer too. And I think midlife is fascinating, but that's just me. Not because I'm about to hit midlife, but also because I think it's just fascinating. Okay? Why is it fascinating to me and hopefully to you by the end of the talk? If not, come talk to me, okay? It's because life expectancy is increasing, right? We know that most people are living in the US, and you're living about, on average 78.8. And all of you probably know this, women outlive men a little bit more, than we love you guys, but the women outlive men a little bit. So life expectancy increases. The other thing that happens during midlife is changes in health. So for those of you, who have experienced midlife or are about to experience midlife, the aching things that you never had when you were in the 20s, you suddenly wonder, where did they come from, right? You're like, that sound is not the door squeaking, it's me that's squeaking, right? And so all of this is happening in midlife. And think about what that means in the context of caring for a son or a daughter with developmental disability, right? There's a lot of things happening, not just with the individual, but also with the child. The other thing that happens in times of transitions, right? So a lot of individuals in midlife, they're kind of thinking about career options, thinking about exiting the workplace, or they're becoming grandparents, they're becoming all these roles that they didn't experience early on, but they're taking on more of these roles. And that also means more demands, more stressors that's happening, right? And so all of these things I'm really interested in because I think, and there's research showing that it shapes your health, your well-being, right? So not just in terms of psychological and physical health, but also your social behavior, health behavior. So that's kind of the thing that interests me in terms of studying this particular population. So you can see what I was talking about in terms of expectancy. Men, average 76 years of age, and women 81. This is a fact, this is statistic reflects statistic done in 2012. So we've gone up a couple points, decimal points, not so much, but still life expectancy is increasing. As Susan, you mentioned, this is my program. I'm interested in, so I have 2 lines, the employment process, how that influences health and well-being at a daily level, and in terms of the impacts of parenting a child with scenario adult with a developmental disability. And so currently I work to combine both of these. And what's overlapping between these 2 lines of research is the role of daily stressors. So I'm going to argue, or not argue, guess that at least somebody in this room in the past 24 hours experienced a stressful event, right? Did anybody experience a stressful event? Okay, right. You don't have to tell me what it is, but so this is something that we think of stressor. We think of a lot of big stressor, like divorce, in terms of somebody that died or something. But the thing that I'm really interested in is the daily stressor, the role of day-to-day challenges that you experience, right? So, for example, traffic, pothole. Did anybody experience pothole on High Street? Oh my goodness, right? This little thing doesn't seem like a big deal, but think about what that means. That poor little car that's coming around, hit it, they're not going to make it to work on time, right? You're not going to make it to this fabulous talk that you're attending, right? But think about it, the deadlines, all of you have deadlines, right? All these things. But the thing is, these are the little things that get under our skin, right? Why is it important? It's important because the daily stressors happens more often than life events, which is actually, if you think about these life events, divorce, death of somebody, you don't want it to happen every day. And if it does, it's very, very stressful and absolutely horrible, right? So these little stressors, doesn't seem like a big thing, but it kind of adds up and creates a lot of persistent chronic health down the line. So think about what this means. So if you have little stressors that happen over every day, this doesn't seem that bad, but if you kind of reflect back on the week that you just experienced, a lot of toll and attention time is allocated to that, to kind of navigating those stressors. And that's what I'm interested in. And the other thing that happens with daily stressors that you see different from other types of stressors is the proximity of that, right? It happens, when it happens, it has a direct effect, right? And it happens more often. So all of this highlights the importance of daily stressors. So looking at, in terms of theoretical framework that kind of underlines a lot of my work is the life course daily stress perspective. I'm like having like an S issue today. So for some of you who are very, very familiar with Glenn and his colleague in terms of sociology, the life course perspective, it highlights the important factors that shape development, specifically contextual factors, right? Also agency in terms of what you bring to the table matters in terms of development. But it's really fabulous, it's really great, but the life course perspective doesn't account for how daily stressors influence health, right? It looks at more at the macro variable and less at the more micro variable. And so, but in terms of the daily stress, the stress literature, they focus a lot on these micro factors, but they kind of overlook some of the big factors in terms of contextual events, right? Context. So what my grad advisor and I did was we combined both, right? We combined the best of both work to look at how transition may affect daily well-being through stressor exposure and stressor reactivity. And this is a chapter in Glenn Elder's work. And there's a lot of good research in that book in terms of looking at methods and looking at how you study life course perspective, life course development, and so forth. So in terms of stressor reactivity exposure, some of you are less familiar with this than others. So what do I mean by that? So stressor exposure is this idea of how likely are you going to experience that stressful event, right? So it's more of this between-person variation, right? So I'm going to pick on my undergrads here, dear panelists. So Ryan, you and Sarah differ from each other, right, in terms of the likelihood that you experience a stressful event. But what are those factors that kind of shape that, right? So that's one thing that we're really interested in. The other thing is stress reactivity. So how do you differ from yourself? Right? Think about this. Think about yourself in terms of on days when you experience a stressor, are you grumpier? And on days when you don't experience a stressor, right? So that variation, that's what I'm interested in. And one of the studies I'll talk about today focus more on the right side of this. So my core undergrad, I'm naming those right here. So in terms of using a daily diary approach and using this life force stress perspective, you can kind of get at this within between person variation. So the between person variation is this idea of you're looking at psychological distress. Some people are more distressed than others, right? And then but think about this, right? There's within person differences too. So think about on days when you are having just a really bad day. You're probably grumpier than a day where things are smooth and going, right? And so think about this as a week, like 5 days. So Alex right there, picking on you here. On Monday, he's having a great day, right? He came back from the Bahamas, yes, you have your kid, you have classes, I don't know. But then you're like, oh, you have stuff to do, right? So you're not that happy. But then overall, you're happy, right? As a whole, the average of the day-to-day variation, you're good. Molly, not so sure, right? But look at me, I'm just absolutely having a bad week, right? Like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I realized I had deadlines that I did not do, or I forgot to go to class that I was supposed to teach. That didn't happen. I had to right? That was really, really bad. And I think other people have really bad, like the brown days would be like bad, right? Everybody. But you see this variation, right? So like for me, I love the cold. You're like, right? So like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday was pretty warm, so I was grumpy. That was my stressful event. It was just really warm, and I didn't want to deal with it. But then today, it's gorgeous, right? Like you guys are like, no, absolutely horrible, right? Absolutely horrible. So this is the stuff that I'm really interested in the context of parenting an adolescent or child, an adolescent or adult with a developmental disability. How do you navigate a day-to-day situation? Okay, and so I need to drink a little water. So that kind of underlines why I'm interested in why I study. And I think it's gives you a perspective in terms of how I approach the work that I do. So I'm going to kind of go into the first presentation, one of the first studies that I did when I was a postdoc with my postdoc advisor of the Mason Institute, Marsha Malik and Jen Wong. So, and as well as my colleague, Jen Wong and Chris Ho. So I'm looking at daily work stressors and how that is associated with awakening cortisol level and others of individuals with and without developmental disability. And so some of the biomarker work, so and you can tell me more about that if you have a question. And the other thing I was going to mention to you, if you have a question at any time during my talk, please just jump in and ask me, okay? So like I mentioned earlier, many of you know this, in terms of why caring may matter. So why am I looking and my colleague looking at this at the midlife and late adulthood? In addition to the fact that life expectancy is increasing, we know that developmental disability is a lifelong process, right? So not just from the parent side, but also from the adolescent and adult side. And we know that a lot of individuals who have developmental disability, they rely on their family member for care. And there's an old study in 2008, so it's been a while, but I suspect the number has definitely increased. According to Braddock's study, about 1.7 million adults with developmental disability are being cared for by a family member. Think about what that means in terms of what's happening in terms of health and wellness. And many of you know this, but in terms of the parenting challenges of caring for somebody with a developmental disability, there's a lot of work that shows that stress level is high. We know that, right? But what we don't really know too much about is the different types of stressor, how different types of stressor may navigate and affect health, right? We know stress is high, but how do we differentiate that? And that's one thing that we're trying to figure out in this particular paper. The other thing that my colleagues have shown is that in addition to stress level, so not just the macro stress, but also the daily stress, individuals who are parenting an adolescent or adult with a developmental disability, they have greater physical symptoms, aches, pains, headache, those kind of things. And that's been shown by my colleague, Mia Smith. And so it's not just stress, but you're talking about physical symptoms. So it's the cumulative effect of all these health factors that's going on. And the other thing we know is that employment and social participation is lower for parents who are caring for somebody with a developmental disability. So all of these just doesn't paint a really good picture, but at the same time we want to know how does that influence your health and wellness, right? And there's some of my work and my colleagues' work has shown that parenting an individual with a developmental disability has a lot of toll on your physiological functioning, specifically via cortisol. So cortisol, for some of you who are familiar with it, you know it. Some of you less, so I'll talk a little bit about it. So cortisol is a main product of the HPA axis. You need cortisol because it helps to facilitate normal functioning. You know, it's part. All of you have this rhythm, cortisol rhythm, and it's implicated in a lot of health factors, right? And it's a biomarker of stress reactivity. So that's why I'm interested in it, because it's another indicator of stress other than self-report, right? You can ask somebody how stressed they are, but they might not tell you how stressed they truly are, or they might not know how truly stressed they are. So when I was a grad student, my advisor, they founded a focus on daily stressors. He talks about stress in this idea of stressors in the sense of, how do you cope with stress? Are you like Teflon or Velcro? Think about this. Some people just slide like the Teflon pan, like the egg. You flip it, and it's okay, it doesn't stick. But there are other people just like Velcro, it just cling on, it just doesn't shake off, right? Think about where you fit in that spectrum, right? I suspect many people are in the middle, some of you more, on the Velcro, but other people just nothing ever bothers them. And those are people that irk me a lot because I'm like, how do they're just like slide, like they're just like. So one of my I shouldn't do this because it's videotaping. So my colleague, when I was a grad student, so I guess he was a grad student, so my office mate, nothing just bothered him. Like there's deadlines, yeah, I'll get to it, it's fine. Like everything was just. He was just good. He was so good. I really wanted to measure his cortisol to see if it was really, truly bad or just not, right? But I think it just really was like Teflon. So all of this is, I think cortisol gives us another indicator, another lens to understanding health and wellness in these families too. Does anybody have any questions about cortisol or anything? Okay. So some of the work that I have looked at, the association between cortisol and stressors in parents who are caring for individual developmental disability, they've shown that, and some of my work too, that we see this blunted pattern of cortisol response. So most of you, do you mind if I use that, or is that okay? Yeah. So all of you here have, so this is the axis, all of you have this rhythm of the diurnal cortisol rhythm, right? So when you wake up, your cortisol typically spike. Because think about what's happening when you wake up. You want to get ready for the day, right? You want to prepare for all this thing you have, meetings, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, you don't want to stay activated the whole time because you're always heightened, right? And that's not good because your body needs to recuperate. So over the course of the day, it goes down and it kind of just goes back up and down again, right? So what we're finding out is that, so that's kind of the rhythm. But what we're finding is that for parents who are caring for somebody with a developmental disability over the long term, we see this blunted low level. So it doesn't look like this, rise, kind of stays hidden. And so this doesn't sound so bad, but here's the thing, folks. There's other work looking at individuals with PTSD, functioning, all these things, and that cortisol pattern matches these individuals. Think about this, caring for somebody with a developmental disability is as your cortisol pattern is resonate with somebody that has PTSD, this chronic stress, right? And so, but the thing is that we're wondering, well, is it because of the stressors that we're measuring, that we're capturing this blunted level of pattern? Is that what's going on, or is it that we're just not capturing the right thing? The reason I say this is because there's some work in the PTSD literature that says individuals who experience PTSD typically have this low pattern of cortisol response, right? But when you realize that when they expose them to stressors that are not triggers of the PTSD event, the traumatic event, they actually show this normative pattern. So we're curious, well, most of the work that looked at the association between cortisol, stressors, they looked at family-related child-related factors, so child behavior problem. We know that's a really big stressor, right? So I was interested, my colleagues were interested in looking at non-child, non-family related stressor, specifically work stressor, right? And I know people were argue, well, it's still over, right? But in terms of how we measure it, we're focusing just on work stressor, and I'll get into more details. So there's a lot of work looking at the interplay between work, caregiving, and cortisol. But the thing is, it's mostly on parents who have children that are developing. And even then, the findings have been really, really mixed. And so when I was going through the literature, and I was just very surprised at how mixed it was. Some people argue that there's this high level, some people argue that there's low level, others found no association. And the reason I think is because of the methodological approach, the way they define employment. So for example, Adam and Gunnar, they actually combine homemakers with women who are working outside the home. So it's kind of, you wonder, like, how does that work? But they define that because if you're working at home, shouldn't it be counted as work? And some people will argue, yes, it should. So if you think about this murkiness of it, it would affect your results, right? Your findings. The other thing that is happening is in terms of the number of occasions that people are collecting cortisol. So ideally, you would like to have 2 to 3 days of cortisol collection in multiple time points so that you capture the rhythm. Right? The thing is, it's expensive. So we're collecting cortisol. We'll be collecting cortisol in our sample. We're collecting on one day, which is a limitation. But one assay, so one occasion, is about $20 per assay. So think about what that means. If you want 16 samples, right, which is what my grad advisor did in their study, that's a lot of money. So you hopefully have an R1 to kind of help you fund that, right? But if you don't, then that's something to think about, right? So the goal of this particular study is to look at how stressful work event influence the waking cortisol level in mothers of adolescents and adults with and without developmental disability. And now we get into what we mean by developmental disability too. So there are 2 hypotheses that we came in with. So we expected a main effect of parental status on the waking cortisol level. The reason we expected this is because in line with past studies that found that mothers of individuals with developmental disability, they have lower parental levels. So we expect that they will have a lower level than comparison parents. So parents who are caring for a child that does not have a developmental disability. But at the same time, we argue that there will be an interactive effect of parental status and work stressor, such that mothers of individuals with developmental disability, they will actually have a higher cortisol level following the day where they experience work stressor than on the day where they did not experience a work stressor. And this is in line with the TTSD literature that says that, in response to a non-trigger, non-target stressor, they may have a more normative response. We did not have a hypothesis for the comparison sample in terms of the interaction because of the mixed finding. We just didn't have any good support in terms of whether we expected high or low. And so that's something that we wish we had a better hypothesis, but we didn't. So in terms of the participants derived from 3 studies. So the 3 studies, they actually utilize the same diary study design. They also utilize the same protocol for cortisol. So for those of you who are methods, you're wondering, 3 studies, there's method and merits, all of that. Know that the protocol collection diary study is exactly the same. It was actually administered by the same company that did the phone call and everything too. So the first study that where we drew the mothers of individuals with developmental disability, it came from the adolescents and adults with autism study, and that's the study that my postdoc mentor, Marsha Medley, and Jen Wong, that's one of their studies. And it's basically mothers, with a child with a developmental disability, with autism, and they track them. They're actually in timeline now. I think they started in 1990, and so about 18 months apart. And at the very beginning of timeline, there were about 406 individuals. There's some attrition that happened, so it is what it is. The other study that we derived the mothers of individuals with developmental disability is the Fragile X study, so the families of adolescents and adults with Fragile X syndrome. Some of you are familiar with Fragile X. So for those of you who don't, we Fragile X is the most common inherited intellectual disability. And there's some similarity overlaps. For the Fragile X study, at time one, there were 147 mothers, and so you're probably thinking in your mind, well, how do you combine both, right? Like, why do you combine both? I want to let you know, so all the analyses I did, we separated the mothers, the Fragile X mother, the autism mother, and then we combined it. And when we separated them, the findings were the same pattern, they were very similar, so we decided to combine the mothers for power, for increase of power. But we did examine all of it just to make sure that what we found wasn't, we're not masking those associations. So one thing that we want to do is, because people always argue, well, how do you know they're stressed, right? What's your comparison sample? And so we decided to have a comparison sample that we drew from the MIDAS study, the Live Life in the United States study, which derives from Wisconsin. So are people familiar with the MIDAS or not that much? Okay, so the MIDAS study started in the mid-90s, and they collected the data again in the mid-2000s, and right now they're collecting the third wave, and also they have another subsample. This is what my grad advisor, he's a principal investigator for the daily diary component, so I worked on this. I know it in the back of my hand because I did do a lot of data cleaning. Not that any of you experience it, or but it's good. I'm sure many of you have experienced it. So the MIDAS study is actually a study, a population sample of men and women in the U.S. looking at their health and wellness. So that's the focus. We're really interested in all these health markers. And so not only do they have self-reports, they have biomarkers of cortisol, they also have all these data on them in terms of biometric data. So there's the MIDAS data, there's 5 projects, and one of the projects, they actually fly participants into these different centers, and they do an overnight stay. They collect blood, they draw all these things, and they do scan. And so all of this data, so you have all this data, but it focuses mostly on health and wellness. And the thing about this is it's a public data set, so if you're interested in secondary analyses, this is a free data set with all these biomarkers. So in terms of what we did was, because they utilize the same diary approach, the cortisol collection, so we drew a comparison sample of mothers of individuals without developmental disability from this data set. The second study that I'll present to you, so my postdoc mentor is absolutely really creative with how they approach data, like how they approach things. They actually found that there's a subsample of parents in the study who are caring for a child with a developmental disability. So they're able to kind of use this population sample and draw another way to study these individuals too. And so the MIDAS data has the diary study, which is what is shown here. In terms of the analytic sample, because the AAA and the Fragile X study, they comprise only of women, we had to exclude men from the MIDAS study. So we focused just on women. Because of our interest in employment, they had to be working, right? It doesn't make sense if they didn't work. And we categorized them by the number of hours they work, and here's how we define whether they're working, also their employment status. We were able to pull that information out. The other thing that I'm interested in, because I'm interested in how stressful things that influence cortisol level the next day, so that we have a better direction effect. So we kind of say, okay, if you have stressful event, how does your cortisol look the next morning? We wanted them to work on the day prior to the cortisol collection. So cortisol collection is across 4 days, the diary study, so there could be days where they overlap with weekend, assuming if you don't work on the weekend. So we have to tease that out. And the other thing, we wanted people who are co-residing with their child, right? Because it's a very different process. If you're co-residing with the child with a developmental disability, it's perhaps more engagement, more interaction versus somebody whose child is on the move. It's sort of the day-to-day process looks very different, right? So based on all these criteria, we ended up with 124 mothers of individuals with autism and Fragile X. This is combined together, and 115 comparison mothers. You can see that's the sample size window, right? But it's still sufficient where we have enough power. So, if you're interested in that, this is really hard to read, but it's the sample characteristics. So on the left column is mothers of individuals without developmental disability. On the right is mothers of individuals with developmental disability. I'll just give you age, basic stuff. So you can see that mothers of individuals with developmental disability were significantly older than the comparison parent, the comparison mothers. And they actually were more likely to be married. They had higher education. And that partly, I think, is attributed to the Fragile X mother. For some reason, the mothers in the Fragile X syndrome, they have really high education in the particular sample. And so I think that kind of drives it up a little bit. In terms of the income, this is long. So we have the mothers of individuals with developmental disability significantly higher. But there were no difference in terms of number of children in the household. But that was something that we worried about in terms of, you have the burden, you have to think about, is it some other children that's kind of contributing to the stressors that you may be experiencing? So in terms of the protocol, so the protocol consists of the interview and the questionnaire, and then afterward, all of them participate in a daily diary component, which, so it's basically 8 days across, so 8 consecutive days. And on days 2 to 4, they provide a saliva sample. So this is that. So for those of you who are grad students, or undergrad, who's going to help on my study, those are my fingers right there. So let me tell you, I wrap a lot of saliva too. And at some point, I got sick of the neon, yellow, green, all of that too. So, but there was a lot of sample. Why? Because there were 16 samples. They collected 4 samples on each day. So they had awakening. So right before you wake up, before you get out of bed, then 30 minutes after you're awake, and then lunchtime and bedtime. And all of this, they asked you for cortisol. So for those of you who are interested in collecting cortisol, be careful with the lunchtime sample. That is a sample that people are not compliant. Think about your lunchtime, right? Does it vary across the day? Do you forget to take lunch, right? I know some of you were eating your lunch. Good for you. It's really good. Breakfast is good too. But so that's why some people argue, well, how do you caption the food and how many occasions, right? And so this was a long process, but because there are some people that collected 16 samples on one day, or some people collected multiple. But for the month, in terms of cost, benefit, all that, 4 occasions they realized we captured in the rhythm. But the lunchtime probably you go without too. And you ask them for cortisol. There are different ways to get cortisol, to ask you for cortisol: hair, urine, blood. But saliva sampling is probably the most non-invasive approach, and that's what we did. We didn't want to burden these families too much either. In terms of the predictor, so the first one is parental status. Are you a parent of a child with a developmental disability, or are you, versus a parent without a child without a developmental disability? And so that's how we define the parental status. And then work stressor. So it's actually not as simple as it looks. You think, okay, you just get the work stressor. But the way it's because the goal of the MITE study, as well as the other study, was to look at health and wellness, and we utilized the same protocol for the autism study and the Fragile X study, so we kind of follow what they did. So we utilized the daily inventory of stress relief event. My grad advisor and his grad advisor worked on that. And it's basically 8 open-ended questionnaire, and you ask, did you experience certain types of stressor in the past 24 hours? So for example, in the past 24 hours, did you have an argument with somebody, right? Yes or no. But then in addition to yes or no, you can say, who did it occur with, right? Somebody, your spouse, your partner, somebody at work. So you get more of that nuance, right? And so another question is, did you have an avoided argument with somebody? Think about yourself, right? Did you have an avoided argument? I'm going to tell you, that's a big one. I'm not looking at that, but that's a big one in terms of people. A lot of people have avoided arguments. They just let it go, right? I feel like that's like frozen, so let it go. So what we did was, because it wasn't simple, and they also within the DICE measure, they asked, did you experience work stressor? So what was happening was that people would say, no, they didn't experience it. We saw very few people report it, very few frequency of it. And that's because they already reported work stressor in the other one. So they had to avoid the argument with their supervisor, right? Think about that, right? You could just let it go. And so what we could do is to go through all of it and kind of code that. And so what we did was we created a composite based on all this information on whether somebody experienced work stressor or not. And in terms of the outcome, we focus on awakening cortisol level. So as I mentioned to you, they looked at multiple occasions. Why do we focus on awakening cortisol? It's because we were interested in this directionality, right? So if we're looking at work stressor the previous day and looking at cortisol the next day, we have a better idea of the lag effect, right, in terms of directionality of that. And also, awakening cortisol is a good marker, indicator of your HPA axis, how healthy and well you're doing. So that's the reason why we're looking at those that particular occasion. In terms of control, we control a lot of different things in terms of age of the mother, medication and collection time, as well as negative affect. So your mood actually is very predictive of your cortisol level. So all of this, we can control. We also looked at marital status and some of the characteristics and some of the variables that differ between the two groups, but it didn't play out. It didn't make a difference, so we can just drop them as control. In terms of analyses, we utilized a set of multi-level modeling models, two-level data nested within person using SAS and Proximix. So you can use this in other ways, but I like SAS, so that's what I did. Okay. So in terms of finding, as predicted, we found that mothers of individuals who are caring for an adolescent or adult with a developmental disability, they had a low level of awakening cortisol compared to the comparison parents, right? So this made an effect of lower level awakening cortisol. And we also found that there was a significant interaction between parental status and work stressor, such that for the mothers of individuals with developmental disability. So you can see on this particular graph here. So you can see this, right? I feel like the color lost it. So this actually works. I think it got lost in translation, I guess. So this column here is work stressor that's present, and this is present and absent on the left. So you can see that on days when mothers experience a work stressor, their cortisol level the next morning is actually higher, right? So we see this, and it's actually, we're really excited to see this because it says to us that when it comes to work stressor, so non-family or child-related stressor, that we're actually seeing this elevation, so which is good because it's more normative, right? So all of you, when you experience a stressor, most of you will kind of, your cortisol will go up, and that's what we were hoping to see when it comes to stressors that are not specific to child or family. And so this is what we found. Do you have any questions about that? Is it confused or okay? So we're really excited to see that. But as a whole, the idea of low blunted cortisol, we still see that these mothers have lower level than the comparison method, right? So that still rings true. But in terms of the type of different stressor, we're seeing this differential response, right? Depending on the characteristics of the stressor. So I think our work really resonates in terms of the PTSD literature in terms of this low blunted level. At the same time, it's showing that different types of stressor really matter. So you really should think about this in your work. Not all stressor is the same, right? And I think if you know how you respond to a work stressor may be different than how you respond to an argument with your partner or significant other, right? Whether it's commitment level or severity of the stressor, that's something that we didn't really take a look at in terms of how severe was the stressor. We just looked at whether the stressor was present. So I think it's important to think about these different characteristics because it does have differential physiological effects on the individual. Now let's go over to the next slide, the next study. So this one is kind of hard to see. Is it hard to see a little bit? Yeah, sure. Thank you.
So I was trying to understand the results. So is it that is a way to interpret the fact that sort of chronic stressor of your providing care for a person with DD leads to this blunted reactivity, but then that acute stressor of maybe having that work stressor in the prior day spikes them?
So yes, so like the different types of stressor. Yeah, so thank you for using these like stressor terms like acute, chronic, so fabulous. So that's what we're saying that is chronic. How do you navigate your life in the context of chronic stress? But we have these acute stress. How does it navigate in the same path, right? Or does it navigate differently? And so that's what we're saying, that they're navigating it in a slightly different way. Yes?
So why would you expect to see the same spike in the group that doesn't have that has with DD following the work stress?
Well, so I think so we're going back and forth about this, and I think and we're still trying to figure this out because we don't understand why in the literature, right? It just like sometimes it's good and bad. Because ideally you should see it, but we just didn't find it in the sample.
So that was what unexpected.
Yeah, that was unexpected because we were hoping that we would see this, but it didn't. I mean, the slope wasn't significant. You could slope, it just wasn't. And in fact, the other way, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, but I think that's the thing that we still can't figure out is because the heterogeneity of these. Well, the jobs, that's the other thing too, because we didn't look at occupation. It doesn't give us, the data doesn't give us, the autism and the fragilized data, it doesn't have information in terms of the level, in terms of occupation that the MIDAS has. And so it could be that we're seeing, the type of job you have is going to have different approaches. But yeah, we can't, that was unexpected though.
I think I wondered about a kind of experience model of thinking about PTSD as a correlate that you see this sort of hyperreactivity and hyporeactivity paired together. So I wonder if there's sort of overreactivity to these other stresses even in the context of blended reactivity.
Right. So, but that's, yes, I think,
stress.
yeah, and I think that's something that we're really interested in. How do we, it's hard to tease it out without, and I think that's the thing, secondary data, where it's either the autism and the fragilized, they're primary data, but these things came afterwards. And so when you go into the science, how do you tease those out? But those are questions I think we still haven't, we just haven't teased out. And I think we're interested in it, we just don't know how that works together too. And then also the other thing is here, and that's a great point, the two questions too, because we're just looking at cortisol, right? But there are other markers, right? There's other markers of health and wellness, biomarkers. And so that's something that people are looking at in terms of allostatic low, which is a bunch of different markers, and looking at how these things low how they low on each of them, and then what does it look like as a composite score too. And so that's something that the autism fragilized data, we just have cortisol, so we don't have all the biomarkers that the MIDAS has, and so that's something to think about, right? So okay, it looks like this in cortisol, but what does it look like in other type of markers too? Any other questions for you? Okay. But thank you, those are good questions. So it's really hard to see, but it's, I'm looking at work families so on psychological and physiological functioning in midlife parents of caregivers, midlife parental caregivers of individuals with and without developmental disabilities. So this this study was kind of ignited by the previous study, because one thing that we did for the first study was to look at presence of work stressor, right? But the thing is, we don't really ask them about spillover, right? So we assume that there's a stress, if you experience a stressor at work, that's a bad thing. But we don't ask them to the extent where it's how the spillover affects each other, and how does that play out in terms of your health and wellness, right? And so work on work and family spillover, and vice versa, family and work spillover, that has been studied a lot in terms of health and wellness, from Phyllis Mullen to Hochschild to Lindy Marson and Greenbach. All of this, it's a very important part of understanding health and wellness, right? So as you can see from this, ideally you would like to have this perfect balance of work and family, right? Think about your life. Do you have this perfect equation, right? I see some algebra going on, maybe not, right? So ideally, that's great, right? But the truth of the matter is, we all have too much to do, right? So it's this balance, like which one goes which, right? So for those of you who ever saw those old movies, I love old movies. Okay, Baby Boom, right? I think it's like 1987. I'm like dating myself here, and it's basically like she's like not inherit, but like a friend passed away, and so she kind of became the guardian of the child, and she's this businesswoman that's absolutely businesswoman, and so she takes the child. You see, she wants to clean the kid with like some spray, like Windex. Don't do that. But like, look at this father, right? This not just comment too, because fathers navigate this. You're trying to work and you put a baby on your lap. You just hope the baby's going to stay, right? So this balance of work and family, it's an integral part of everybody's life. And there's a lot of work that show the directionality of this, and most of the work has shown that there's more spillover from work to family. And that is more common, and that has more deleterious effects on health and wellness. right? But the thing is, there's this attention in
Never
parents
thought you
kids with looking at the parents caring for Allison's involved with the adult with disability. There's so much, in terms of the attention, I think it's less studied than the other populations, so I think that's why I'm really interested in this interplay between caregiving and work. And then also there's lower rates, like I mentioned, in terms of employment, right? And so one thing to think about is, well, how can we better understand the spillover such that we can create policy to kind of help out these families, right? And as the previous study and also other studies show that there are different effects physiologically in terms of work stressor and home stressors. So I was interested in the interplay between work and family and psychological and physiological functioning in middle-aged men and women who are caring for a child, an adolescent, or an adult with or without developmental disability. And so what I want to argue, and what we argue, is that even though the literature has shown that there's more spillover from work to family, and that affects health in the worst way, I want to argue that in this particular population, if you're caring for somebody with a developmental disability, we're arguing that the stronger effect would be going from family to work, such that it's going to have it's going to affect your health and wellness too. And so in terms of how I assess psychological wellness, so psychological distress in terms of negative affect and positive affect. And we argue that higher negative work to family, that's supposed to be family to work, that's supposed to be family to work, I apologize for that. So higher negative family to work spillover, it's going to result in higher negative affect and lower positive affect. In terms of cortisol, here I'm going to look at morning cortisol and as well as bedtime. So I told you how morning cortisol is an indicator of how low your HPA axis is in the morning in terms of preparing for the day. At the end of the day, we want your cortisol to come back down because you don't want to stay heightened. And we've noticed that if you're experiencing these stress or chronic stressors, they typically stay high. So in this particular paper, we would argue that you'll see this higher effect in terms of the bedtime cortisol level because they're not coming back down. So for this particular study, I'm focusing just on the MIDAS study because in the autism and the Fragile X study, they don't have these more spillover factors. And here, I mentioned this to you a little bit earlier, so it's a rehash. In this particular study, I'm looking at men and women together there too. And so we have another aspect to this. And specifically, I needed them to be working, so they had to be employed. There are some work-family spillover factors, variables, so they had to have complete data on this. And then they had to participate in the daily diary data in order for us to access the cortisol variables. They had to be co-residing, and then had to be living with the child. So based on this, we had 69 parents of individuals with developmental disability, and then 278 comparison parents. So one limitation of this study is that because of how MIDAS was designed, because it's not aimed at looking at parents of kids with different types of developmental disability, we don't have a large sample of that. Instead, we have different, so we have combining different diagnosis too. And so I think that's one limitation, yes.
So do we know the age of the children with disabilities?
So there are, so that's something that, so there are so for this particular study, even if I say child, they're older than 18. So yeah, so adults, yeah. And that's something that's a very good question, right? Like, it's very different, right? In terms of the sample, and I realized that I should have put the columns don't match the previous one, I should have done it in the same way. And so the development, so you can see from this, the comparison parents actually are a little bit older. They're more likely to be married, and then they have fewer number of children in the household. But there was no difference in terms of the gender difference or sex difference in terms of the two groups too. So we utilize the same approach, diary approach, and so forth. I'm going to breeze through this limited on time. And then in terms of predictors, we have parent status. So parents of kids with developmental disability versus parents of kids without developmental disability. And then the work family spillover, and then family to work spillover available, and I'll show you all of those too. And know that there's negative and positive aspects to family and work spillover, excuse me, and they're measured separately, they're measured in different ways. Not different ways, they're measured in non-consistent scale. So the items are, there are 4 items for each, and it's on a 5-point scale, never to all of the time. So in terms of the work family, okay, so in terms of the animation issues here, so in terms of work family spillover, in terms of negative, this is what it looks like. So your job reduces the effort that you can give to activities at home. Stress at work makes you irritable at home. So some of you may relate to this, some of you not. But I know you have a great work environment, so this does not apply to you at all. Okay, so ignore the animation issue here. Okay, but then there's the positive, right? So how does work play into your family? So the things you do at work help you deal with personal and practical issues at home, right? Or, the skills that you use on your job are useful for things that you may do at home. So all of this stuff, I'm really interested in how that navigates and how that is associated with psychological and physical. And this is a negative for family to work spillover. They're slightly different from the other one. And so for example, this is pretty similar to the other one. The first one is responsibility at home reduces the effort you can devote to your job. Right? Stress at home makes you irritable at work. Personal problems distract you when you're at work. So I assume all of you here are thinking or listening to my talk, but it could be in your head right now. You're like listening in your mind what you have to do at home, right? So that's a distraction. So things like this where it kind of spills over. And it's the positive, where talking to somebody at home helps you deal with problems at work, right? These things that it's not just negative, but there's also positive spillover. In terms of the outcome, positive effects. So there's 6 items, and we asked them in the past 30 days, right? And so example is good spirit, cheerful, and the items are added average across the 6 items too. And then you have negative affect, hopeless, so sad, nothing can cheer you up, all of that. And then we looked at cortisol level, bedtime in the morning. And I forgot to mention that the result that I showed you, we logged the cortisol level. We log the cortisol value because the raw score is low. I mean, you can treat it as raw, but in terms of the log value, is more interpretable and it's easier for us to display. And I usually have a set of hierarchical regression model and then multi-level modeling too. They must nested in within person. The reason why I use 2 different approaches is because the negative affect or positive affect, we don't have that at the daily level. But the cortisol, we have it at multiple occasions. There can have a host of controls too. Okay, in terms of the results, so we found in terms of, so here's the thing, we didn't find any association with positive things, which is bad, right? Because you hope positive spillover is good, but we didn't find any association with health. But we did find that there was a parental status and negative family to work spillover on negative affects, such that for those individuals who experience high, this is plotted by unstandard deviation. So you can see here, if you're a parent of a child with developmental disability and you experience greater negative family to work spillover, significantly you have greater negative affect, right? So that's in line in terms of what we thought. But for those people who sit, in terms of low level of negative affect, low level of family to work spillover, that didn't play out. In terms of this one, we also found an interaction between parental status and negative family to work spillover on bedtime cortisol. We didn't find any association at the morning level, but we did find it for the bedtime level. I promise there was a graph here. There was, like right there. So there's no difference in terms of if you had low level of negative family to work spillover, but at the high level there was. So the DD parents are the white bar as you see here. And so they actually had, when they had greater negative family to work spillover, they had higher level of bedtime cortisol, which means that they're not coming back down, which is not good. And so that's what we realized that so it's not just the morning, but we also need to pay attention to the bedtime. And there's circadian rhythm, which I won't go to, but if you have questions about that, yes.
Did your findings from the first study replicate in this in terms of, did you compare overall DD parents with the comparison parents at resting levels in the morning, just overall across all?
Yes, so we did, I didn't show you that, so we did find that initially it is low.
It was low.
It was blunted, yeah, too. So that made us feel good about this, because otherwise we're like, right, even though it's a different sample, but we still find that for DD, and even though there's variations. So really fast. So I think it's really important to think about the different family stressors, different types of stressors, and how that influences in terms of health and wellness. One thing that we really don't ask people about when we ask parents about all the challenges of caring for a child with developmental disability, we kind of forget that they have other aspects of their lives. We don't ask them about work, right? We don't ask them about all these things. I think we're beginning to do more and more in terms of social activities, all of that. So I want you to think about it from this side now too. But the other thing what I'm really interested in is the protective factor. So one thing that I think a colleague and I are working on, we're kind of thinking about this, is how leisure protects is a good way to kind of physical activity. How does that help navigate the challenges of caring for somebody with a developmental disability across the lifespan, right? We know how physical activity is really good for your health, but it also brings a social aspect to it. So it's kind of multiple positive protective factor. How does that play out? And I think it's really there's not much work on this. Actually, I had my undergrad did literature research, and there's absolutely not much on there. And so I think if you're interested in health, look also at leisure. Okay. And one last thing, I know it's time to go. I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the Understanding Parenting study. Dr. Sarah Shafi-Sullivan and I are working on this. She kind of talked about it a little bit. We got a little small secret, and my students are working on this. And we're interested in looking at couples, so mothers and fathers, how they're parenting a child with autism and without autism. And the reason why we're doing couples is because fathers are often neglected in this, right? And they're important. But also we're interested in this co-parenting process. So how do they together parent the child, right? And the thing that I'm really interested in is not just between family variation, but also within family variation too. So in our study, in addition to asking the parents to report on their child with a developmental disability, we're going to also ask them to report on another child, so sibling. So how they kind of navigate this within family and between family processes. So that's what we're looking at. And we're going to collect cortisol. And so if you're interested in looking at this thing, this is our collection kit. And so I can pass around if you're interested. But so we're going to have only one day because of limited money. And so we're collecting this, and hopefully people will do this. And so we're in the process of recruiting right now, so we're almost there. If you have any questions, I know I'm almost out of time. I'm going to stay here, so if you have any questions, let me know. Are there any questions right now? Yes.
In the beginning, you were saying you weren't sure, or there was discussion about whether to differentiate between those parents who stay at home and those who work outside the home. Is there any research that talks about the negative and positive impacts of things like telecommuting and less time, working at home, or owning your own business?
Right. So in this particular population, I don't think people have looked at that, but I think in terms of, I know shift work, that's a big issue in terms of the typically developing population. So people are looking at that, and so your circadian rhythm, that completely drives it out of whack. We have shift work, right? But in terms of, I don't know, I don't have an answer, but I can look, if I get your contact information, I can find out too. But that's a great question, because we're not living in a society where it's 9 to 5, right? Like, I'm sure many of you come in or work on weekends or at night, and so I think all of this is really, I think it's really important to think about in terms of work. Like, what does that look like, and how can we navigate that, right? Okay.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming. We're ready to leave, but if you're interested and have more questions, you're welcome to stay.